Tonight, take a deep breath, relax, and let us slowly explore the story of tea. Tea is the most consumed drink on Earth after water. More than 2 billion cups are poured every single day in kitchens and palaces, in roadside stalls and mountain monasteries, in offices and gardens and hospital waiting rooms across every inhabited continent on the planet. If you added up all the tea consumed on Earth in a single year, it would come to something like 6 billion kilograms of dried leaves, enough to fill an almost unimaginable number of cups. And yet, for all its quiet, familiar presence in our daily lives, the story behind this simple drink is one of the longest and most surprising stories in the history of human civilization. It is a story that stretches back at least 5,000 years, to a time when the earliest ancestors of the tea plant grew wild in the misty highlands of southwestern China. From those forests, the leaf traveled outward along mountain passes and river valleys, carried by Buddhist monks and caravan traders, until it had reached almost every corner of the known world. Along the way, it shaped empires and toppled them. It funded wars and inspired peace ceremonies. It built fortunes for colonial merchants and broke the backs of millions of laborers. It triggered a revolution in North America, 2 wars in China, and the largest organized smuggling operation in British history. It changed the economies of India, Sri Lanka, Kenya, and Japan. It influenced poetry, painting, philosophy, architecture, and religion. And through all of this, it has remained, at its heart, an extraordinarily simple thing, just dried leaves placed in hot water. That is the story we will tell tonight, slowly and gently, from the very beginning to the present day. There is no need to hurry. The tea will steep as long as we need it to. So let us begin at the very beginning, with the plant itself, because everything that follows, every war, every ceremony, every quiet cup sipped late at night, all of it flows from the nature of a single, modest, evergreen shrub growing in the mountains of Asia. The tea plant belongs to a family of flowering plants that includes roughly 300 species spread across the tropical and subtropical regions of Asia. Most of these are ornamental, the sort of plants you might see in a garden, lovely to look at but of no particular use in the kitchen. But one of those species, just one, produces leaves suitable for making tea. And within that one species, there are 2 main varieties that account for nearly all the tea grown in the world today. The first is a smaller leafed variety, native to southeastern China, particularly the provinces of Yunnan, Sichuan, and Guizhou. If you were to visit these places, you would find yourself in a landscape of steep, misty hillsides and deeply carved river valleys, where the air is cool and damp and the soil is rich and acidic. This variety of tea plant is hardy, patient, slow-growing, and it produces leaves with a more delicate flavor, making it ideal for green teas, white teas, and many of the lighter, more subtle teas beloved by connoisseurs. The second is a larger leafed variety, native to the Assam region of northeastern India and parts of nearby countries like Myanmar. This one is a different sort of plant altogether. It thrives in hot, tropical, lowland conditions, grows vigorously, and produces leaves with a bolder, more robust character, well suited to the strong black teas that much of the Western world pours into its cups each morning. These 2 varieties split apart genetically an estimated 22,000 years ago during the last ice age, when shifting climates separated populations of wild tea plants into different mountain refuges across southern and southeastern Asia. A major scientific study of the tea plant, published in 2017, revealed something rather remarkable about its inner workings. The plant's full set of genetic instructions is about 3 billion units long, roughly comparable in size to our own human set, and an unusually large number of its genes are dedicated to producing the very chemical compounds that give tea its flavor, its aroma, and its effects on the human body. In other words, the tea plant has been quietly perfecting its chemistry for millions of years, long before any human hand ever reached out to pluck a leaf from its branches. Now, There are three groups of chemical compounds in tea that matter most, and the way they work together determines everything from the color and taste of the brewed cup to the way it makes you feel when you drink it. Let me describe them in plain terms, because understanding them helps explain why tea has captivated so many people for so long. The first group is responsible for that slight bitterness you taste in tea, that mouth-drying, brisk sensation that tea drinkers know well, sometimes described as the bite of a good cup. These same compounds are also powerful protectors against certain kinds of damage inside the body, which is part of the reason tea has been prized as a healthful drink for many centuries. Here is an interesting detail. When tea leaves are allowed to darken and change during processing, as happens when making black tea, these protective compounds transform into different, larger, more complex ones. And it is these transformed compounds that give black tea its warm reddish amber color and its smoother, deeper, less sharp flavor compared to green tea. So the very chemistry that makes green tea taste bright and brisk is the same chemistry that, when allowed to change, gives black tea its mellow depth. All from the same leaf, just handled differently. The second important compound is the gentle stimulant, the one that wakes you up and helps you focus. Tea contains the same stimulant found in coffee, but in tea, it exists in a slightly different chemical setting. In tea, this stimulant forms bonds with other compounds in the leaf, and this means it is released more gradually into the body after you drink it. This is one reason why many people find that tea gives a smoother, more sustained lift compared to the sharper and sometimes jittery jolt that coffee can provide. The energy comes on more gently and fades more slowly. And then there is the third compound, and this one is perhaps the most distinctive and interesting thing about tea. It is a particular substance found almost nowhere else in nature, not in coffee, not in most other plants, almost exclusively in the leaves of the tea plant. This substance has the remarkable ability to cross into the brain and gently increase the type of brain activity associated with relaxed alertness and creative thinking. When this calming substance works together with the gentle stimulant, as it does naturally in every single cup of tea, the result is a state of focused calm that neither substance could produce on its own. This unique pairing, this natural combination of alertness and serenity, may help explain why tea has been the preferred drink of monks sitting in meditation, of scholars bent over their manuscripts, of writers searching for the right word, and of thinkers across so many different cultures and so many centuries. There is something about tea that sharpens the mind while soothing it at the same time, and that combination has drawn people to the leaf for thousands upon thousands of years. The plant itself is a quietly remarkable organism in terms of its toughness and its longevity. Wild tea trees in the forests of Yunnan, China can grow to the height of a 5-story building and can live for hundreds, even thousands of years. The oldest known tea tree, standing in a remote county of Yunnan province called Fengqing, is estimated to be approximately 3,200 years old. Can you picture that for a moment? This tree was already old when the Roman Empire was at its height. It was already ancient when the Greek philosophers were debating in Athens. It was standing in its forest when the Great Pyramids of Egypt were still considered relatively new constructions. And it is still alive today, more than 10 meters tall, with a trunk nearly 6 meters around, standing in a subtropical forest on a misty mountainside at an altitude of roughly 2,200 meters. It is a living connection to the very dawn of human civilization, quietly growing season after season, century after century. In cultivation, tea plants are kept trimmed to about waist height, pruned into the familiar flat-topped hedgerows you might picture on a tea plantation postcard. This encourages the constant growth of new, tender shoots, the 2 leaves and a bud that form the standard unit for high-quality tea picking. The plants prefer abundant rainfall, acidic soils, and they do particularly well at higher altitudes, where cooler temperatures slow their growth and concentrate the flavor compounds in their leaves. This is why teas from famous mountain regions, whether from the hills of Darjeeling in India, the Wuyi Mountains of China, or the highlands of the island once known as Ceylon, tend to command the highest prices on the world market. The slower the plant grows, the more flavor it packs into each leaf. And here is an irony worth pausing on, a gentle twist in the tale that is worth knowing. The very compounds that make tea so valuable to us, the stimulant, the bitter protectors, the calming substance, none of these evolved for human benefit. Not one of them. They are the plant's own chemical weapons, developed over millions of years of evolution to defend against insects, fungi, and competing plants. The stimulant is toxic to many insects and also stops the seeds of rival plants from sprouting when it seeps into the soil from fallen leaves. The bitter compounds fight off infections and fungi. It is one of the great happy accidents of natural history that the chemical arsenal a humble shrub evolved to protect itself turned out to be precisely the combination of compounds that would make it one of the most desired plants in all of human civilization. The plant was defending itself. We fell in love with its defenses. Now let us travel back in time, far back, past the written records and the ancient empires, to the earliest days when human beings first encountered this plant in its native forests. Long before tea was a beverage, before it was a ceremony or an industry or a cause of war, it was simply a leaf on a tree in a forest, and the story of how people first found that leaf and recognized its special qualities is shrouded in the deep prehistory of southwestern China. The evidence is sparse and fragmentary, as you might expect for something made from a plant that decomposes quickly in the soil and was consumed thousands of years before writing was invented. But the evidence that does exist, painstakingly gathered by archaeologists and chemists over recent decades, tells a quietly remarkable story. The wild ancestor of all cultivated tea grew, and still grows, in the mountainous forests of Yunnan province in southwestern China. This region is one of the most botanically diverse areas on the entire planet. Surveys have documented wild tea trees across several provinces, with the greatest concentration and the oldest specimens found in Yunnan's remote mountain counties. Ancient trees, some well over 1,000 years old, dot the forests, representing forms that sit somewhere between fully wild and partly cultivated. This suggests a long, gradual process of taming the plant, stretching over many centuries rather than a single sudden moment of agricultural invention. The earliest inhabitants of this region were people who lived in intimate contact with the land, who knew every useful plant in their forests as a matter of survival. Studies of the indigenous peoples still living in Yunnan reveal traditions of tea use that reach deep into their oral histories and cultural identities. The Blang people consider themselves the original cultivators of tea. The Diang people have a creation story in which their entire group descends from tea leaves, and they use tea in marriage ceremonies, in settling disputes, and in religious rituals. These are not recent customs adopted from the wider Chinese world. They are ancient traditions that speak of a relationship between people and this particular plant that is older than any written record we possess. The most important archaeological discovery linking tea to the ancient past was announced in 2016, and it made headlines around the world. A team of researchers analyzed plant remains found in the tomb of Emperor Jingdi of the Western Han dynasty, a ruler who died in 141 years before the Common Era. His tomb, part of an elaborate burial complex near the city of Xi'an in central China, contained a wooden box filled with what appeared to be small decomposed plant buds. Using advanced techniques that could detect the chemical fingerprints of specific compounds, even in badly degraded material, the researchers found unmistakable traces of substances found almost exclusively in the tea plant. This confirmed that the material was indeed tea, making it the oldest physically identified tea in the world, roughly 2,100 years old. Think about what this tells us. The presence of tea in an imperial tomb means that tea was already, by that early date, a luxury commodity considered worthy of accompanying an emperor into the afterlife. It was placed alongside rice, millet, and animal offerings, provisions meant to sustain the ruler in the world beyond death. Tea was already valued. It was already special. It was already meaningful. The same research team also examined plant remains from a burial site far away in western Tibet, dated to roughly the 2nd century of the Common Era. Those remains too tested positive for tea compounds. This was a quiet but profound revelation because it meant that tea had reached the Tibetan plateau several centuries earlier than anyone had previously believed. It also provided physical evidence for the existence of an ancient trade route connecting the tea-growing lowlands of central China to the high, remote plateau of Tibet, a foreshadowing of what would later become one of the most important and most grueling trade roads in all of Asian history. The earliest clearly identifiable written reference to tea as a prepared drink appears in a document from 59 years before the Common Era. Written by a scholar named Wang Bao, it is a humorous contract listing the duties of a household servant, and among those duties are buying tea at a particular market town in the Sichuan region and boiling tea to fill the household utensils. The fact that tea appears here as a routine domestic task, something a servant would simply be expected to know how to do, tells us that by the middle of the 1st century before the Common Era, tea drinking was already an established ordinary practice among the educated classes of southwestern China. It was not exotic. It was not rare. It was simply part of life. And so we see that the foundations of tea culture were laid very long ago indeed. By the time of the Han Dynasty, tea was already a traded commodity, consumed by emperors and commoners alike, woven into the fabric of daily life in the regions where it grew. Everything that followed, all the elaborate tea cultures of later centuries, all the wars and revolutions and ceremonies, was built upon this ancient, quiet groundwork. Now, every great drink has its origin story, a tale that takes the messy, gradual, forgotten reality of actual discovery and compresses it into a single vivid moment of revelation. For wine, there is the story of an ancient Persian king whose abandoned grapes fermented by accident. For coffee, there is the tale of an Ethiopian goatherd named Kaldi, whose goats danced with unusual energy after eating mysterious red berries. And for tea, the origin story belongs to a figure called Shen Nung, the divine farmer, a legendary emperor said to have ruled in the earliest days of Chinese civilization. According to the most common version of the legend, Shen Nung was sitting beneath a tree one day, sometime around 2,737 years before the Common Era, boiling water to drink. He was a wise ruler, a scholar and herbalist who believed in the importance of drinking only boiled water for health. As he sat, a gust of wind blew several leaves from an overhanging wild tea tree into his pot. The water turned a golden brown color and gave off a pleasant, inviting aroma. Being a curious man, a man of science as his legend tells it, he tasted the infusion rather than discarding it. He found it refreshing and invigorating, and thus, the legend says, tea was discovered. It is a lovely story, and it captures several themes that would define tea culture for millennia to come. The serendipity of the discovery, the importance of boiled water, the scholarly curiosity of the discoverer, the natural, unforced, almost accidental quality of the whole experience. But we should understand Shen Nung as mythology rather than history. He is not a real historical figure, but a cultural symbol, a personification of the agricultural and medical knowledge that accumulated over countless generations of collective human experience. There is a variant of the legend in which Shen Nung was out in a field, testing the medicinal properties of different plants by eating them one by one. He was poisoned 72 times in a single day, but each time he chewed on tea leaves and was cured. This version emphasizes tea's role as a medicine rather than a pleasure, connecting it to the ancient Chinese tradition of herbal healing. There is also a Buddhist origin story, quite different in character. A monk from India, credited with bringing a particular school of meditative Buddhism from India to China, was sitting in a cave, determined to stay awake for 9 years as a spiritual discipline. After several years, he fell asleep. When he awoke, he was so furious at his failure that he tore off his own eyelids and threw them to the ground. Where they landed, tea plants sprang up, and from that day forward, monks used tea to help them stay alert during long hours of meditation. This is, of course, a fantastical tale, but it serves an important cultural purpose. It connects tea to the world of spiritual discipline, to the long hours of quiet contemplation that define the monastic life. And this connection between tea and spiritual practice would echo through centuries of history in China, Japan, Korea, and beyond. There is one more thing worth knowing before we move on, and it concerns the very name of this drink, because the word itself tells a story of how tea spread around the world. The two main words for tea found in languages everywhere both come from Chinese, but they took different paths through history. In Mandarin Chinese, the word is pronounced roughly like cha. This pronunciation traveled overland along the ancient trade routes through Central Asia, the Middle East, and into South Asia, giving us the Hindi chai, the Farsi word, the Turkish word, the Russian chai, the Arabic word, and the Swahili chai, among many others. But in the dialect spoken along the coast of Fujian province, the word is pronounced more like te. This pronunciation traveled by sea, carried by Dutch merchant ships, giving us the English word tea, the French word, the German word, the Spanish word, the Dutch word, and the Malay word. By looking at which word a language uses for this drink, you can trace whether that culture first received its tea over land or across the sea. This single linguistic fact is a small, elegant key that unlocks one of the most remarkable stories of global cultural diffusion in all of human history. And so we move on now, from legend and language into the great ages of Chinese tea culture. During the Han Dynasty, which ruled China for roughly 4 centuries beginning around 200 years before the Common Era, tea completed its transition from a regional wild plant of the southwest into a commodity known and consumed across much of the vast Chinese empire. During this period, tea was valued primarily for its medicinal qualities. A famous physician of the time observed that drinking bitter tea constantly helps one think more clearly and sleep less, an early recognition of the stimulating properties that modern science would eventually trace to specific compounds in the leaf. The way people prepared tea during the Han Dynasty was quite different from what any modern tea drinker would recognize. The leaves were not delicately steeped in the manner we know today. Instead, they were boiled vigorously in water, often together with ginger, onion, orange peel, or various spices. The result was closer to a thick, savory soup than to a clear, elegant infusion. This boiling method would persist in various forms for centuries, and echoes of it can still be found in some regional traditions, such as the butter tea of Tibet. The idea of drinking tea as a pure, simple infusion of nothing but leaves and hot water would not become the dominant method for a very long time. Tea was consumed by both the wealthy and the common people during this period, though in different ways and for different reasons. For the educated classes, tea was a refined substance, a fitting companion to scholarly pursuits. For ordinary people, especially those living in tea-growing regions, it was a practical, everyday drink that gave energy for labor, aided digestion, and offered a safe alternative to untreated water. This distinction between elite and popular tea culture would persist throughout all of Chinese history, with the upper classes continually developing more refined methods, while common folk continued to enjoy tea in simpler, heartier forms. Now let us turn to what many consider the true golden age of tea in China. The Tang dynasty, which lasted from the early 7th century to the early 10th century of the Common Era, was a period of extraordinary cultural achievement, a time when China was arguably the most cosmopolitan and confident civilization on the planet. Its capital, The city we now call Xi'an was the largest city in the world, home to over 1 million people, its wide avenues filled with merchants, diplomats, monks, and travelers from across Asia and far beyond. Chinese culture during this period was outward-looking, curious, receptive to new ideas and new pleasures. And it was during this remarkable age that tea was transformed from a useful everyday drink into a high art, a subject of literature and philosophy, and a commodity so economically important that it became a pillar of government revenue. At the very center of this transformation stands one of the most remarkable and unlikely figures in the history of any food or drink, a poor, orphaned, self-educated writer named Lu Yu, whose single short book about tea changed the course of an entire civilization. Lu Yu was born around 733 of the Common Era. According to tradition, he was abandoned as an infant and found by a Buddhist monk named Ji, the head of a monastery in what is now Hubei province. The monk raised the boy in the monastery where he was expected to become a monk himself. But the young Lu Yu showed no inclination whatsoever toward monastic life. He rebelled against the religious discipline and the menial tasks assigned to him. When pressed to embrace Buddhism, he cited other philosophical traditions, arguing that a truly dutiful person should not abandon the possibility of continuing his family line. The abbot, angered by this defiance, assigned him even more humiliating work, including cleaning the latrines, hoping to break his stubborn will. It did not work. At some point in his youth, Lu Yu ran away from the monastery entirely and joined a traveling theater troupe where he reportedly worked as a clown and writer of comic sketches. Can you picture this scene? A runaway orphan from a Buddhist monastery performing jokes and skits at village fairs across the Chinese countryside. It seems like the most unlikely beginning imaginable for the man who would become the patron saint of tea. But this unlikely career brought him to the attention of a provincial governor who was impressed by the young man's intelligence and wit and offered him access to a library and the opportunity to study with a tutor. This patronage was the turning point of Lu Yu's life. He threw himself into learning with a passion and began the lifelong pursuit of tea knowledge that would define his entire legacy. His great work, often translated as the Classic of Tea, was written between approximately 760 and 762 of the Common Era. It is a surprisingly short book, only about 7,000 Chinese characters, roughly the length of a long article in a modern magazine. Yet within those pages, Lu Yu created the first complete guide to tea ever written anywhere in the world. He covered everything one could possibly want to know: the plant itself, the soils it prefers, the altitudes where it grows best, the tools used for picking and processing, the method of roasting, grinding, and boiling the compressed tea cakes that were standard in his day, the quality of water and where to find the best springs, the precise stages of boiling identified by the size and sound of the bubbles in the pot, and he specified 24 separate implements for proper tea preparation, from the wind furnace for heating water to the bowls for drinking, each one carefully designed for a specific purpose. The impact of this modest little book was enormous and almost immediate. It elevated tea from a common everyday drink to a refined cultural practice with its own aesthetic principles, its own specialized vocabulary, and its own material culture of carefully crafted tools. It created a new kind of expert, the tea master, someone who could evaluate and appreciate tea with the same discernment that an art critic would bring to a painting or a scholar to a poem. And it helped spread tea drinking across all levels of Chinese society, transforming it from a regional habit of the South and Southwest into a truly national institution. Lu Yu himself became a beloved cultural hero. He was given the honorary title Sage of Tea and was eventually honored in Chinese folk tradition as something close to a minor deity. Tea merchants in the Song dynasty, several centuries later, kept small ceramic figurines of Lu Yu in their shops as good luck charms. When business was brisk, they poured tea over the little figure in gratitude. When sales were slow, they placed him in hot water as a gentle punishment. These figurines survive in museum collections today, charming evidence of the extraordinary affection the Chinese people felt for this poor orphan who gave them the art of tea. The Tang dynasty also produced one of the most famous tea poems in all of Chinese literature. A poet named Lu Tong, who lived in the early 9th century, wrote a poem about drinking 7 successive bowls of tea. With the first bowl, he wrote, "The lips and throat are merely moistened." With the second, loneliness is banished. The third searches through the dry gut and finds nothing there but thousands of volumes of writing. The fourth produces a light sweat, and all the wrongs of a lifetime evaporate through the pores. The fifth purifies the bones and flesh. The sixth opens a communication with the realm beyond the ordinary. And the seventh cannot even be finished, because the drinker feels a cool breeze rising under both arms and is gently lifted toward the heavens. This poem captures the Tang dynasty ideal of tea as something more than a physical drink, as a vehicle for transcendence, for moving beyond the ordinary world into a state of lightness and freedom. The Tang dynasty also saw tea become a source of government revenue for the first time. In 780, the government imposed the first tax on tea in Chinese history, recognizing that tea had become a commodity of sufficient volume and value to be worth taxing. This tax would remain a feature of Chinese government finance for the next 1200 years, a remarkable span of fiscal continuity. Let us continue forward now into the Song dynasty, which lasted from the middle of the 10th century to the late 13th century of the Common Era. If the Tang dynasty was the era when tea became an art, the Song dynasty was the era when it became an all-consuming passion. The most dramatic change was in how tea was prepared. Instead of grinding tea into powder and boiling it in a pot, as in the Tang period, Song dynasty tea lovers placed finely ground tea powder in a wide, shallow bowl, poured in hot water in a thin, steady stream, and vigorously whisked the mixture with a bamboo whisk until it produced a thick, frothy, creamy foam. Everything about the quality of that foam mattered. Its whiteness mattered greatly. Its thickness was carefully judged. Its texture was closely examined. How long it lasted before fading. Competitions developed around who could produce the finest foam, and these tea battles became popular social events that combined elements of sport, art appreciation, and intellectual discussion. Participants often composed poems during or after the contest, and the results were debated in letters and essays. The bowls used for this whisked tea became objects of extraordinary beauty. The most prized were dark, almost black bowls fired in kilns in Fujian province, decorated with distinctive patterns caused by iron-forming crystals during the firing process. These patterns were given poetic names. Fine parallel streaks were called hare's fur, scattered silvery dots were oil spots, larger, more irregular markings were partridge feathers. The dark color of these bowls was not simply decorative. It served an essential practical purpose, providing contrast that made it easier to judge the quality of the white tea foam against the dark interior. Some of these bowls were exported to Japan, where they were treasured as masterpieces and are kept in museums to this day. Emperor Huzong, who reigned during the early 12th century, was the most tea-obsessed ruler in all of Chinese history, and his story is worth lingering on for a moment. He was a man of extraordinary artistic gifts, a talented painter, calligrapher, and poet who was far more interested in beauty than in the hard business of governing. In 1107, he personally wrote a detailed treatise on tea, describing how to judge quality, what distinguishes an excellent leaf, and precisely how to whisk the perfect bowl. He devoted careful attention to describing the ideal foam, distinguishing between the light, fleeting foam of an inferior preparation and the thick, brilliant, long-lasting foam that marked true mastery. He is one of the few rulers in all of human history to write a book about a drink. The tribute tea system reached its most elaborate form during the Song period. Each year, the very finest teas from specially designated imperial gardens were compressed into ornate cakes decorated with dragon and phoenix designs, symbols of the emperor and empress, and sent to the court. The production of these tribute cakes required thousands of workers and created teas of such staggering cost that ordinary citizens could never hope to taste them in their entire lives. When the Mongol conquest finally ended the Song dynasty in 1279, this exquisite culture of whisked tea was severely disrupted within China. The Mongol rulers had different tastes and different priorities, but the tradition did not die. It had already been carried across the sea to Japan by visiting Buddhist monks, and there, in a very different cultural setting, it would be preserved, refined, and elevated into something the world had never seen before. And here the story takes a quiet but revolutionary turn, because the dynasty that followed the Mongol period in China, the Ming dynasty, brought about a change as simple in its expression as it was profound in its consequences. In 1391, the founding emperor of the Ming dynasty, a man of peasant origins who had fought his way to the throne through years of rebellion and war, issued an imperial decree that would fundamentally alter the course of tea history, not only in China but around the entire world. He abolished the centuries-old system of tribute tea cakes and ordered that tea be submitted to the court as loose leaves instead. His stated reason was characteristically practical. The elaborate production of those ornate compressed cakes was wasteful of resources and placed too heavy a burden on the people who grew and processed tea. But the effect of this decree was revolutionary. By sweeping away the compressed tea tradition with a single stroke, this emperor launched what we might call the loose leaf revolution, the birth of the very method of steeping whole leaves in hot water that the vast majority of tea drinkers around the world practice today. This shift gave rise to new tools, new techniques, and new ways of experiencing tea. Most importantly, it gave rise to the teapot. The Ming dynasty saw the emergence of small, unglazed stoneware teapots from a city called Yixing in Jiangsu province, crafted from a unique mineral clay found only in that area. This clay, often reddish-purple in color, had a remarkable quality. It was naturally porous, meaning it slowly absorbed the flavors and oils of the tea brewed inside it over time. A teapot used for years or even decades with the same kind of tea would develop a subtle character and a gentle patina that enhanced every subsequent brewing. Devoted tea lovers believed, and still believe, that a well-seasoned Yixing pot could produce a superior cup even with rather ordinary leaves, because the pot itself had absorbed years of flavor into its very walls. Individual potters became famous artists who signed their work, and their creations are prized by collectors today, some of them selling for extraordinary prices at auction. The loose leaf revolution also gave birth to a method of brewing, sometimes described as tea prepared with great skill, which uses a small teapot or a lidded bowl, a generous amount of loose leaves relative to the amount of water, and many short steepings rather than one long one. Each steeping, lasting only a few seconds to a minute, draws out different flavors from the leaves, so the drinker experiences the full range of the tea's character over the course of a quiet, unhurried session. The first steeping might be light and floral. The third might be richer and sweeter. The sixth might reveal a deeper, more lingering quality that was hidden in the earlier cups. This method is still widely practiced in China and Taiwan and is increasingly loved by tea enthusiasts around the world who are discovering the extraordinary depth of experience that this patient, attentive approach to tea can offer. The Ming period also saw the beginnings of deliberate experimentation with different processing methods. Green tea remained the most common and most prestigious, but partially darkened teas, the ancestors of what we now call oolong, began to appear in the mountains of Fujian province and Guangdong province. And fully darkened teas, the first true black teas, are believed to have emerged in the late Ming period, possibly in the Wui Mountains, perhaps as an improvised response when a passing army disrupted the normal processing schedule and forced tea makers to let their leaves sit longer than intended. Whether or not that particular story is true, the palette of tea was becoming richer and more varied with every passing generation. Now, let us step away from the succession of Chinese dynasties for a while and consider one of the most important and enduring threads in our entire story, the deep relationship between tea and Buddhism. Buddhism arrived in China from India during the Han Dynasty and gradually spread across the country over the following centuries, establishing monasteries, translating scriptures, and developing distinctively Chinese forms of thought and practice. The most important of these developments was a school of Buddhism that emphasized direct, personal experience of truth through meditation, sitting quietly and observing the nature of the mind, rather than through the study of texts or the performance of rituals. And the connection between this meditative tradition and tea was natural, almost inevitable when you think about it. Meditation requires a very specific mental state, one of sustained alertness combined with deep physical stillness. You need to be awake, focused, and attentive, but you also need to be calm, relaxed, and free from agitation. Tea is uniquely suited to support exactly this state. The gentle stimulant provides wakefulness and concentration. The calming compound promotes quiet, centered attention without the restlessness or jitteriness that other stimulating drinks might produce. Monks who spent hours in seated meditation, often in cold, drafty mountain temples where the wind crept through the wooden walls, discovered that tea helped them maintain precisely the quality of awareness their practice demanded. Alert, but not agitated. Calm, but not sleepy. Focused, but not tense. This practical discovery was quickly formalized in the rules of monastic life. Tea was served before and after meditation sessions at mealtimes and during formal religious ceremonies. Special monastic officers were appointed to oversee its preparation, and detailed rules governed who received tea, in what order, and in what manner. The act of making and serving tea itself became a form of meditation, a mindful practice in which every gesture, every movement of the hand, every pour of the water was performed with full, undivided attention. One famous teacher from this Buddhist tradition became known for giving the same reply to nearly every question his students asked. Whatever they wanted to know, however profound or paradoxical the question, his answer was always the same 3 words, simply, "Go drink tea." This seemingly plain instruction carries within it a deep teaching. True understanding, it suggests, is not found in the realm of abstract thinking or clever argument. It is found in the direct, immediate, fully attentive experience of ordinary, everyday life. Drinking a cup of tea with complete presence and awareness is as much a spiritual practice as any other. Buddhist monasteries were among the first institutions to cultivate tea in organized gardens, and many of China's most famous tea-growing regions were originally cleared and planted by monks who chose their mountain locations for isolation and spiritual atmosphere, and then discovered that those same misty, high-altitude locations happened to be ideal for growing beautiful tea. When Buddhism spread outward from China, traveling along the overland routes of the Silk Road into Central Asia and Tibet, and crossing the sea to Korea and Japan, tea traveled with it as a faithful companion. In each new land, it was Buddhist monks who carried the seeds, the knowledge, the techniques, and the enthusiasm. Let us follow the tea now across the sea to Japan, where it would become the foundation of perhaps the most refined and philosophically profound ritual ever built around a single drink. Tea first arrived in Japan during the 8th century, brought by monks who had studied in Tang Dynasty China. A monk named Saicho, founder of an important school of Japanese Buddhism, is credited with bringing tea seeds from China around 805 and planting them near his monastery on a mountain outside Kyoto. But these early introductions did not lead immediately to a widespread tea culture. Tea remained rare and mostly confined to the imperial court and the Buddhist clergy for several centuries. The truly decisive moment came in 1191, when a monk named Aisai returned from his second extended period of study in Song dynasty China. Aisai brought back not only seeds of the Song tea variety, but also, crucially, the Song method of preparing whisked powdered tea, the very technique that had been the crowning achievement of Song dynasty culture. He planted tea seeds in several locations and wrote the first Japanese treatise on tea, presenting it as both a health aid and a spiritual companion. In this book, he connected tea drinking explicitly to the practice of meditation, establishing the idea that would echo through all of subsequent Japanese culture, the idea that tea and the spirit of meditation are, at the deepest level, one and the same thing. Over the following centuries, Japanese tea culture evolved through the hands of a series of brilliant, devoted teachers who progressively refined it into something unlike anything the world had ever seen. Early Japanese tea culture, it should be said, was not always refined. Tea tasting competitions among the warrior aristocracy were often extravagant, rowdy affairs involving gambling and drinking, with participants trying to identify teas from different regions. These gatherings were, in many ways, the opposite of the austere, spiritually grounded tea culture that would later emerge. The transformation began with a monk named Murata Juko, who studied meditation under a celebrated teacher and developed the concept of a simpler, humbler approach to tea. He turned away from the ostentatious display of expensive imported Chinese utensils in favor of modest, locally made pottery and small, unpretentious tea rooms. He said the essence of tea is like the cooling of the moon behind clouds, a poetic image suggesting that beauty is found not in perfection and brilliance, but in the imperfect, the subdued, the partially hidden. This aesthetic, this love of the humble and the understated, would become the defining characteristic of the Japanese tea ceremony. This philosophy reached its most complete and enduring expression in the life and work of Sen no Rikyu, born in 1522 in a prosperous merchant city near modern Osaka and universally recognized as the greatest tea master in all of Japanese history. He began studying tea at the age of 17, and over the course of a long and extraordinary career, he served as tea master to the most powerful military rulers in Japan, men who commanded armies and controlled the fate of millions. Rikyu's contribution was transformative. He reduced the tea room to its smallest possible dimensions and created a tiny entrance, only about 70 centimeters square, through which every guest, no matter how powerful, had to crawl on hands and knees to enter. This was a deliberate act of spiritual architecture. Even the mightiest warrior lord, even the ruler of all Japan, had to bow low and make himself small to enter the space where tea was served. Inside that small room, all the hierarchies and distinctions of the outside world fell away, and host and guest met on equal terms, united in the shared experience of a bowl of tea. Rikyu chose tea utensils for their simplicity and their rough, natural beauty rather than for their monetary value. He famously preferred a cracked or asymmetrical bowl over a flawless one, because the imperfection expressed a deep Buddhist understanding that perfection is an illusion and that true beauty lives in things that are natural, weathered, unfinished, and marked by the passage of time. He articulated 4 guiding principles for the way of tea: harmony, the sense of rightness in the relationship between host and guest, between utensils and season, between the gathering and the natural world. Respect, meaning treating every person and every object with genuine care, regardless of rank or price. Purity, meaning both the cleanliness of the space and the openness of the heart. And tranquility, the deepest and most difficult principle, the inner peace and freedom from grasping that, is the goal of both the tea practice and the meditative path from which it grew. His life ended in tragedy. The powerful warlord Hideyoshi, whom Rikyu served, was a man of enormous ego and extravagant taste, and the relationship between the two men eventually broke down beyond repair. In 1591, Hideyoshi ordered Rikyu to commit ritual suicide. The reasons remain debated by historians, but the result is not in question. On his last day, Rikyu performed the tea ceremony one final time, gave his favorite tea scoop to his chief student, composed a farewell poem, and took his own life at the age of 69. His tradition was continued by his descendants and students, who established 3 schools of tea practice that endure to this very day, more than 4 centuries later. Now let us travel to the Korean peninsula, where tea has its own deep and distinctive history spanning well over 1,000 years. Korean tea culture is less widely known than its Chinese and Japanese counterparts, but it possesses a quiet beauty and a distinctive character that are well worth knowing about. Korean tea traditions occupy a gentle middle ground between the elaborate formality of the Japanese ceremony and the more relaxed approach found in China. The Korean way of tea emphasizes naturalness, sincerity, and the unaffected enjoyment of good tea in good company, reflecting a Korean aesthetic ideal that values beauty which appears unforced, as though shaped by nature rather than by deliberate human design. Tea came to Korea through Buddhist monks who traveled to China for study during the Tang dynasty and brought back seeds, techniques, and enthusiasm. A monk is credited with bringing tea seeds from China and planting them on a mountain in the southern part of the peninsula around 828, and that region remains one of Korea's most important tea-growing areas to this day. The golden age of Korean tea was during the Goryeo dynasty, which lasted from the early 10th to the late 14th century. This was also the golden age of Korean Buddhism, and the two were inseparable. Tea was central to Buddhist monastic life in Korea, and the Goryeo court adopted tea as a symbol of culture and refinement. Elaborate tea ceremonies were performed at state events, diplomatic receptions, and religious observances. The magnificent Korean celadon pottery of this period, with its distinctive blue-green glaze and elegant, understated forms, included tea bowls, caddies, and other implements that are now regarded as masterpieces of ceramic art. The Korean preference for this gentle, natural pottery reflected an aesthetic ideal quite different from the dramatic dark bowls of Song dynasty China or the rough, rustic wares of Japanese tea culture. Korean teaware seems to glow with a quiet, inner light, as though the beauty of the natural world has been captured in the clay itself. When a later dynasty adopted a new state philosophy and began systematically suppressing Buddhism, tea culture suffered alongside the monasteries. The production and consumption of tea declined significantly among the educated classes. Tea retreated to the Buddhist temples, where monks continued to cultivate and drink it, and to the southern provinces, where the climate favored tea growing and rural communities maintained the habit. The flame of Korean tea was kept alive through centuries of relative neglect by individual monks and scholars. A revival came in the 19th century, led by a Buddhist monk often called the Sage of Korean Tea, who wrote beautifully about the history, preparation, and spiritual meaning of tea. His work laid the groundwork for a modern renaissance that continues to this day, with traditional tea houses opening in Korean cities, universities establishing tea culture programs, and Korean tea practitioners engaging in dialogue with their Chinese and Japanese counterparts. And now, let us journey along one of the most extraordinary trade routes in all of human history, the ancient Tea Horse Road. Picture a network of narrow mountain paths, swaying rope bridges woven from plant fibers, and treacherous high passes blasted by wind and snow, connecting the tea-growing lowlands of southwestern China with the vast cold plateau of Tibet. At its peak, this road stretched nearly 1,400 miles across some of the most extreme and punishing terrain on Earth, climbing from subtropical river valleys at low elevations to mountain passes above 5,000 meters, where the air held barely half the oxygen found at sea level. The temperatures could plunge far below freezing even in summer, and the risk of death from avalanche, altitude sickness, or bandit attack was a shadow that never left the traveler's side. The name of the road tells you what drove the trade along it. Chinese tea flowed westward and upward to Tibet. Tibetan horses flowed eastward and downward to China. Chinese governments desperately needed horses for their cavalry. The Tibetans needed tea as a survival necessity. Neither side could easily manage without the other, and this mutual dependence helped maintain a rough balance between the two civilizations for nearly 1,000 years. Among the most remarkable people who ever walked this road were the tea porters of the Sichuan section, men who carried enormous loads of compressed tea bricks on their backs using heavy wooden frames. Some of these men bore loads of 150 kilograms or more, roughly the weight of 2 fully grown adults, up steep mountain paths at extreme altitude. They might cover only 10 to 15 kilometers in a single exhausting day. The journey from one key trading town to the next typically took about 3 weeks, and the full round trip, including the return with lighter goods, could take 2 months or more. The physical toll was devastating. Many porters suffered permanent damage to their spines and joints. Photographs from the late 19th and early 20th centuries show these men bent nearly double under towering loads that rise far above their heads, their bodies curved like bows under the weight, each step supported by an iron-tipped walking stick pressed hard against the slippery stone path. These images are among the most striking visual records of human endurance and human suffering in the entire history of trade. On the Tibetan plateau itself, tea was not a luxury, not a pleasant custom, not a social nicety. It was a lifeline, a survival necessity in one of the harshest inhabited environments on the face of the earth. At altitudes above 3,500 meters, where the air is painfully thin and dry, the cold relentless, and agriculture limited to a few hardy crops like barley, tea provided warmth, hydration, gentle energy, and essential nutrients that the local diet of barley flour, yak meat, and yak dairy products could not fully supply. The Tibetan way of preparing tea is unlike any other in the world. Compressed tea bricks are boiled in water for an extended period, sometimes several hours, to extract maximum strength from the tough, mature leaves. The dark, strong liquid is then strained into a tall, narrow wooden churn. Yak butter and salt are added, and the mixture is vigorously churned until it becomes thick, rich, and creamy, closer in consistency to a light soup than to what most of the world would recognize as tea. The butter provides fat and calories. The salt replaces minerals the dry, cold air constantly draws from the body, and the tea itself provides warmth and gentle stimulation. The quantity of this butter tea consumed is astonishing. A typical Tibetan might drink 40 or more cups in a single day, sipping slowly throughout the hours from dawn to dark. The host or hostess continually refills the guest's cup so that it remains full at all times. To leave a cup empty is considered impolite. To refuse tea entirely is an insult to the host's hospitality. And the very first thing that happens when a visitor arrives at a Tibetan home or monastery, before any conversation or business or even a greeting, is the offering and acceptance of butter tea. It is the foundation upon which all social interaction is built. Let us leave the plateau now and follow tea as it spreads across other cultures and other lands, because the story of tea in the Islamic world is one of gradual adoption and passionate embrace, producing some of the most distinctive and beloved tea traditions anywhere on the planet. For much of the medieval period, coffee rather than tea was the dominant stimulating drink in the Islamic heartlands. Coffee was discovered in Ethiopia and Yemen and became a cultural phenomenon from the 15th century onward, with coffee houses serving as centers of social life, intellectual debate, and political discussion across the Ottoman Empire and beyond. Tea was known through Silk Road trade, but it played a secondary role for centuries. The shift toward tea in the Ottoman world began in the late 19th century, when the government grew concerned about the cost of importing coffee from distant lands. Tea, they realized, could potentially be grown domestically. The modern Republic of Turkey, established in 1923, made tea cultivation a national priority. The northeastern Black Sea coast, particularly the area around the city of Rise, proved to have ideal conditions with its abundant rainfall, mild temperatures, and steep, well-drained hillsides. The first seeds were planted in the 1920s, and commercial production began in the 1940s. Today, Turkey has one of the highest rates of tea consumption per person in the entire world, rivaling or even exceeding Britain. Turkish tea is brewed strong in a clever two-tiered pot, the lower pot heating water while the upper pot holds a dark, concentrated brew. The concentrate is poured into small, tulip-shaped glasses and diluted with hot water to the desired strength. Milk is never added, but sugar often is. In Iran, tea gradually replaced an earlier coffee tradition during the 18th and 19th centuries, influenced by close diplomatic and commercial contact with Russia. The samovar, borrowed from Russian culture, became a central feature of Iranian tea life. Iranians developed their own charming customs. They traditionally drink tea by placing a sugar cube between the teeth and sipping the hot liquid through it, allowing the sweetness to mingle with each sip in a way the drinker can control. The tea house remains one of the most important gathering places in Iranian society, a place for conversation, storytelling, poetry, and quiet contemplation. In the Indian subcontinent, where a vast Muslim population shares the land with Hindu, Sikh, and other communities, tea became a shared tradition that transcends all religious boundaries. The spiced milk tea known across South Asia, brewed by simmering tea leaves directly in milk with sugar and a blend of spices that might include cardamom, ginger, cinnamon, cloves, and black pepper, is consumed by people of every background. The tea seller, found on virtually every street corner in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, is one of the most recognizable figures in South Asian life. And in Morocco, tea became the centerpiece of one of the most visually striking rituals of hospitality in the entire world. Moroccan mint tea is made with Chinese gunpowder green tea, a tightly rolled variety that has been imported to Morocco for centuries, combined with generous handfuls of fresh spearmint and a large, generous quantity of sugar. The connection between Morocco and Chinese green tea is itself a lovely historical footnote. British traders introduced Chinese tea to Morocco in the 18th century, using it as a market for tea that was surplus to British needs. The Moroccan court adopted the drink, and from there it spread to the entire population. Moroccan mint tea is brewed in a decorative metal teapot and poured from a great height, sometimes a foot or more above the glass, a technique that serves both a practical and an aesthetic purpose. It aerates the tea, creating a slight froth on the surface, and it demonstrates the skill and generosity of the host. The pouring is itself a performance, a graceful display of hospitality. 3 glasses are traditionally offered, and there is a proverb that captures their meaning beautifully. The first glass is as gentle as life, the second as strong as love, and the third as bitter as death. To refuse the offered tea is considered an insult. What unites all of these diverse Islamic tea traditions, despite their enormous differences in form and flavor, is a common thread. The prohibition on alcohol in Islam created a cultural space for non-alcoholic social drinks, and tea filled that space beautifully. The tea house, the offering of tea to a guest, the communal act of sharing a pot, all of these carry a weight of social and spiritual meaning that reflects the deep Islamic values of hospitality, community, and the shared enjoyment of simple blessings. Now let us cross the oceans and enter the European chapter of tea's long story, a chapter that would transform the leaf from an Asian treasure into a global commodity. The first Europeans to encounter tea were the Portuguese, whose maritime empire in the 16th century reached from the coast of Brazil to the shores of Japan. Portuguese traders and missionaries arrived in the Chinese coastal settlement of Macau in the 1550s, and there, for the first time, European eyes saw the Chinese custom of drinking tea. Missionaries wrote letters home describing the habit. A Dominican friar who visited Canton published an account of a bitter drink the Chinese consumed hot, served at meals and during conversation. These were the earliest European descriptions of tea, and they were greeted in Europe with curiosity but no great excitement. The Portuguese themselves never became major tea importers. Their empire was focused on spices, gold, and the trade in people along the African coast, and tea did not immediately seem like a commodity worth pursuing on a large scale. But the Portuguese made one contribution to European tea history that proved enormously consequential, though it came by way of marriage rather than trade. In 1662, the Portuguese Princess Catherine of Braganza married King Charles II of England. Catherine had grown up in a court where tea was already known, and she brought her taste for it to the English court. Upon her arrival in England, she reportedly asked for a cup of tea and was offered ale instead. But her influence was powerful. Tea quickly became fashionable among the aristocracy, and the Portuguese princess thus served as a kind of cultural bridge between the tea cultures of Asia and the drawing rooms of London. It was the Dutch, however, who first brought tea to Europe as a real commercial product. The Dutch East India Company, founded in 1602 and one of the most powerful trading enterprises in human history, began shipping tea from Asia to Amsterdam around 1610. The first quantities were tiny, and the price was very high. Tea was sold in apothecary shops as a medicinal product, marketed for its supposed ability to cure headaches, kidney stones, gout, and various other ailments. Dutch society in the early 17th century, at the height of its celebrated Golden Age, was wonderfully receptive to new luxuries from the East. The prosperous merchant class eagerly consumed Chinese porcelain, silk, spices, and now tea, displaying these exotic goods in their homes with the pride that is so vividly captured in the paintings of that era. If you have ever seen a Dutch Golden Age still life painting with its gleaming silver, delicate porcelain, and rich fabrics, you are looking at the world that embraced tea. A Dutch doctor played a notable role in promoting tea to the public. In 1678, he published a book praising tea as beneficial for virtually every ailment and recommending that people drink 50 cups a day or more. Historians have noted with gentle amusement that this enthusiastic physician was being financially supported by the Dutch East India Company, which had a rather obvious interest in encouraging people to drink as much tea as possible. Whatever his motivations, his book helped establish tea as a fashionable and supposedly healthful drink in the Netherlands. But it was in Britain that tea found its deepest and most enduring home in the Western world, and the story of how an island nation in the North Atlantic, with no natural connection to the tea plant and no prior tradition of tea drinking, became the most tea-obsessed society on Earth, is one of the most remarkable tales of cultural transformation in modern history. The first public sale of tea in England is generally dated to 1657, when a coffeehouse owner in London began offering it to his customers, advertising it as a cure for numerous ailments. In 1660, the famous diarist Samuel Pepys recorded that he had sent for a cup of this China drink, of which he had never tasted before. The fact that he felt the need to explain what tea was tells us how unfamiliar it still was to most English people at that date. After Catherine of Braganza made tea fashionable at court, the East India Company recognized the commercial opportunity and began increasing its imports. In 1669, the company brought in 143 pounds of tea. By 1700, annual imports had risen to roughly 20,000 pounds, and by 1750, they had surged to more than 4 million pounds. The growth was extraordinary. Tea moved through British society with remarkable speed. First, it was an aristocratic luxury, sipped in the palaces and drawing rooms of the wealthy, served in fine imported Chinese porcelain. Then it became a middle-class staple, an essential part of the respectable household. And then, within just a few more decades, it became a working-class necessity, brewed in chipped mugs in cramped kitchens across the country. By the late 18th century, Even the poorest laborers drank tea daily. A man named Thomas Twining helped shape this transformation. In 1706, he purchased a coffee house on the Strand in London and began selling tea alongside coffee. In 1717, he opened a shop dedicated specifically to tea, which was notable for being open to women, who were generally excluded from the coffee houses of the time. The Twining family business continues to this day, making it one of the oldest continuously operating companies in the world. The tradition of afternoon tea, with its tiered stands of finger sandwiches, scones with cream and jam, and delicate cakes, is commonly linked to a duchess in the early 1840s who began taking tea and a light meal in the afternoon to fill the long gap between a light lunch and the fashionable late dinner hour. Whether she truly invented the practice or merely gave it a name, by the mid-19th century, afternoon tea had become an established social ritual across the upper and middle classes. The temperance movement further boosted tea's reputation by promoting it as a wholesome, respectable alternative to alcohol. Large public tea parties drew thousands of working-class families to drink tea and listen to speeches promoting sobriety. Tea became associated with domesticity, moral virtue, and the quiet pleasures of the home. But behind this pleasant domestic picture lay a much darker reality. And here the story of tea takes several deeply troubling turns that we must not look away from. The British government, seeing the enormous and growing demand for tea, taxed it with breathtaking severity. Tea was first taxed in England in 1689, and over the following century, successive governments raised the duty again and again. By the mid-18th century, the tax on tea had reached an extraordinary 119% of its value, meaning that the tax alone more than doubled the price of every pound sold. A cup of legal tea cost far more than most working families could afford. The result was entirely predictable. An enormous smuggling industry sprang up to meet the demand that legal prices could not satisfy. At its peak, roughly 3 out of every 4 cups of tea consumed in Britain had entered the country illegally, smuggled across the English Channel from the Netherlands and France by organized gangs that operated with near impunity. Entire coastal communities in southern and eastern England were involved in the trade. The village of Hawkhurst in Kent was home to a notorious smuggling gang that intimidated magistrates and customs officials and was eventually suppressed only through military force. The profits were so large that they distorted local economies, and the struggle between smugglers and government agents became a defining feature of 18th century English coastal life. The tea that reached consumers, whether through legal or illegal channels, was often adulterated to increase profits. Unscrupulous dealers mixed genuine tea with dried leaves from other plants, sloe, ash, elder, and willow among them, and colored the mixture with dyes to make it look right. Used tea leaves were recycled. Servants in wealthy homes collected the spent leaves, dried them, and sold them to dealers who colored and repackaged them for sale to unsuspecting customers. Some of the coloring agents were genuinely dangerous, including toxic copper compounds used to give fake green tea its color. The crisis was finally resolved in 1784 when the Prime Minister championed a dramatic cut in the tea duty, slashing it from 119% down to just 12.5%. The effect was immediate. Smuggling collapsed almost overnight because the reduced duty eliminated the enormous price gap that had made smuggling profitable. Legal tea imports surged, and government revenue actually increased because the much larger volume of legally sold tea more than compensated for the lower rate. It is one of those rare moments in history when a simple change in policy solved a problem that years of enforcement had failed to address. Across the Atlantic, tea was at the heart of one of the most famous acts of political protest in modern history, one that still echoes in our world today. On the night of December the 16th, 1773, roughly 116 men, some of them crudely disguised in costumes, meant to suggest they were native people, boarded 3 ships moored at a wharf in Boston Harbor. Over the course of about 3 hours, they systematically broke open 342 chests of tea belonging to the East India Company and dumped their contents into the dark, cold water. The tea was worth roughly the equivalent of $1.7 million in modern purchasing power. It was one of the most consequential acts of political defiance in the history of the modern world. The colonists were not protesting the price of tea. The tax on tea in the colonies had not actually changed. What they objected to was the assertion by a distant government that it had the right to tax people who had no voice in that government's decisions. The protesters worked with remarkable discipline that night, damaging nothing on the ships except the tea, sweeping the decks clean afterward, and even replacing a padlock that had been accidentally broken. They wanted to make clear that this was a principled act of political protest, not an act of theft or vandalism. The British response was swift and punishing. Parliament passed a series of harsh measures, closing Boston's harbour until the destroyed tea was paid for and restricting colonial self-governance. But these measures, intended to isolate and punish Massachusetts, instead united all the colonies in opposition. The First Continental Congress convened the following year, and within 2 years, the colonies had declared their independence. Tea had helped spark a revolution. Now, let us return across the ocean to the relationship between Britain and China, where the most painful consequence of the British love of tea was unfolding. By the late 18th century, Britain's appetite for Chinese tea was enormous, tens of millions of pounds per year, and still growing. But there was a fundamental problem. China did not particularly want British goods. The Chinese Empire was largely self-sufficient, and its rulers saw little value in European manufactured products. Chinese merchants were happy to sell tea, silk, and porcelain, but they demanded payment in silver. The result was a massive and growing outflow of precious metal from Britain to China, a hemorrhage of wealth that alarmed those in power. The British found their solution in opium, and it was a solution of devastating moral consequence. The opium poppy was cultivated extensively in Bengal, then under British control. The East India Company established what amounted to a monopoly on opium production, and the drug was sold to private traders who carried it to China and distributed it through networks of Chinese smugglers. The quantities grew rapidly. In 1773, the trade involved roughly 75 tons of opium. By 1820, it had risen to 900 tons. By 1838, it had reached roughly 2,500 tons. The consequences for China were devastating. Addiction spread through every level of society. The drain of silver out of China caused economic hardship and social disruption on a vast scale. When the Chinese government sent a determined official to the port of Canton with orders to stop the trade, he demanded that foreign merchants surrender their opium stocks. When they complied, he confiscated and publicly destroyed roughly 20,000 chests of opium, each weighing about 140 pounds, in an operation that took 3 weeks. It was one of the most dramatic acts of drug enforcement in history, and it was the immediate trigger for war. The resulting conflict was grossly unequal. Britain had steam-powered warships, modern artillery, and professional soldiers. The Chinese military was poorly equipped and badly organized. The war ended with a humiliating treaty that forced China to cede territory, open its ports, and pay a large sum in compensation. A second war, fought in the late 1850s, brought further humiliation, including the burning of the emperor's summer palace, an act of cultural destruction that is still remembered with bitterness in China. The connection between these wars and tea is direct and deeply uncomfortable. Without British demand for tea, there would have been no trade imbalance. Without the imbalance, there would have been no incentive to push opium. Without the opium trade, there would have been no conflict. Every cup of tea consumed in 19th century Britain was linked through a chain of commerce and coercion, to the suffering of millions of people on the other side of the world. Around the same time, another chapter of the tea story was being written, one that would further reshape the global balance of power. In 1848, a Scottish botanist named Robert Fortune embarked on a mission of industrial espionage that would alter the tea trade forever. Fortune was hired by the East India Company for a very specific purpose: to travel into the tea-growing interior of China, which was closed to foreigners, acquire the best tea plants and seeds, learn the techniques of cultivation and processing, and recruit experienced Chinese tea workers, all for the purpose of establishing a tea industry in British-controlled India. To accomplish this, Fortune adopted a Chinese disguise, shaving the front of his head and wearing a false braided queue. Accompanied by Chinese servants who were aware of the deception, he traveled into the tea gardens of two of China's most important tea-producing provinces. During his travels, Fortune made a discovery that was surprising to Europeans but obvious to the Chinese. Green tea and black tea come from the same plant. The difference lies entirely in the processing. He watched as tea makers heated green tea in hot pans to prevent the leaves from darkening, while black tea leaves were allowed to wither and change before being fired. He also observed with some alarm that Chinese green tea destined for the European market was routinely colored with dyes and mineral powders to make it more visually appealing, a practice that exposed consumers to potentially harmful substances. Fortune used sealed glass cases, a recent invention that created miniature self-sustaining environments in which plants could survive long ocean voyages, to transport thousands of tea seedlings from China to the experimental plantations the British were developing in the Himalayan foothills. He also recruited approximately 8 experienced Chinese tea workers who agreed to travel to India and teach their skills. Over several years and multiple trips, Fortune transferred enough plants, seeds and knowledge to give the British tea industry in India the resources it needed to grow. The consequences were immense. Within a few decades, Indian tea production had expanded enormously, and India had overtaken China as the world's leading tea exporter. China's tea monopoly, which had lasted for thousands of years, was broken forever. From the Chinese perspective, Fortune's mission was an act of theft, the pilfering of a national treasure by a foreign agent operating in disguise. The rise of Indian tea is a story of colonial ambition on a massive scale. The first commercial plantation was established in Assam in 1835, and the first shipment of Indian tea reached London in 1838. The industry grew explosively in the decades that followed, driven by speculative investment and the seemingly limitless British appetite for tea. But it depended on a labor system that was deeply troubling. The local people of Assam were unwilling to work on the plantations under the conditions offered, and the British turned to recruiting workers from impoverished tribal regions hundreds of miles away in central and eastern India. These workers were often lured by deceptive promises of good wages and comfortable conditions. Once they arrived in Assam, they found themselves far from home, unable to speak the local language, and bound to the plantation by debt. Laws of the time actually made it a criminal offense for workers to leave before their contracts expired. Working conditions were harsh, with long days, demanding quotas, rudimentary housing, and minimal health care. Diseases like malaria were endemic. The system bore painful resemblances to forms of bondage that existed in other parts of the colonial world. In the highlands of Darjeeling, at elevations between 600 and 2,000 meters in the eastern Himalayas, a different kind of tea was emerging. The cool temperatures, frequent mists, and well-drained slopes produced a tea of remarkable delicacy, a light, floral, almost muscatel-flavored brew that was quite unlike the bold malty teas of lowland Assam. Darjeeling tea quickly earned a reputation as the finest of all Indian teas, sometimes called the champagne of teas, and it commands premium prices to this day. On the island of Ceylon, now known as Sri Lanka, one of the most dramatic agricultural transformations in modern history was taking place. Ceylon had been a thriving coffee producer since the 1830s, but in 1869, a devastating parasitic fungus appeared and began destroying the coffee plantations with terrifying speed. Within a decade, the coffee industry lay in ruins. A young Scotsman named James Taylor had been quietly experimenting with tea on a small plot of land since 1867. He had no formal training in tea but was a careful observer who learned by trial and error. As the coffee failed, the planters who remained on the island increasingly turned to tea as their salvation. The climate and soil of the Central Highlands proved beautifully suited to the plant, and the industry grew rapidly. The man who did the most to turn Ceylon tea into a global brand was Thomas Lipton, born in Glasgow in 1848, the son of poor parents from Northern Ireland. Lipton had built a chain of grocery stores through aggressive marketing and competitive pricing. In 1890, he traveled to Ceylon and purchased several tea estates. His strategy was revolutionary. By owning the plantations, the processing facilities, and the retail shops, he controlled every step of the supply chain and could sell tea at prices that undercut his competitors. His slogan was simple and direct, promising tea straight from the gardens to the teapot. His packaging innovation, selling tea in pre-measured packets rather than loose from a chest, made purchasing convenient and consistent. The Lipton brand became a household name around the world, and it remains one of the most recognized tea brands more than a century later. But the labor that made Ceylon's tea possible came primarily from the Tamil population of southern India. Hundreds of thousands of Tamil workers were recruited, and in many cases coerced, into migrating to Ceylon. They formed a distinct, isolated community on the highland plantations, working under difficult conditions for low wages. After independence in 1948, the new government stripped the estate Tamil community of their citizenship, rendering roughly 1 million people stateless. This injustice persisted for decades, and though it has been partially resolved, the community remains among the most vulnerable in Sri Lankan society. Let us lighten the mood now with one of the most romantic chapters in tea's long story, the era of the tea clippers. During the middle decades of the 19th century, the fastest and most beautiful sailing ships ever built raced each other across 3 oceans to bring the first tea of the season from China to London. These ships were designed for speed above all else, with sharply raked bows, narrow hulls, and enormous spreads of sail. They could reach speeds of 15 to 17 knots in good conditions, and they could cover the roughly 16,000 nautical miles from China to London in as little as 99 days. The demand for speed was driven by economics. Fresh tea, the first picking of the season, commanded a significantly higher price than tea that had spent months in a warehouse. The ship that arrived first could sell at a premium, and the premium was large enough to justify the enormous cost of building and racing these magnificent vessels. The most famous event of the clipper era was the Great Tea Race of 1866. In May of that year, 11 ships loaded with the new season's tea departed from a port in Fujian province within days of each other, all bound for London. The race narrowed to a contest between 5 ships, and for 99 days they sailed across 3 oceans, their captains pressing every possible advantage. 2 of them, the Ariel and the Taping, arrived in the Thames estuary on the very same tide on the 6th of September, after a voyage of more than 16,000 miles. The result was so astonishingly close that the prize money was split between them, and a 3rd ship arrived just hours later. The race was reported breathlessly in the British press and became one of the defining stories of the Victorian age. But even as the most famous clipper of all was being launched in 1869, the age of sail was ending. The Suez Canal opened that same year, providing a shortcut between the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean that could only be navigated by steam-powered ships. Sailing vessels could not use the canal effectively and had to continue the much longer route around the southern tip of Africa. Within just a few years, steam had replaced sail in the tea trade entirely, and the beautiful clippers passed into history. The most famous of them all survives as a museum ship in London, a monument to the tea trade and to the vanished age of sail. Now let us turn to a different kind of story, the tale of how tea was reinvented for the modern world. The 20th century brought a series of innovations, all of them born in the United States, that fundamentally changed how much of the world consumed tea. The most important of these was the tea bag, and its origin story has a charming accidental quality to it. A New York tea merchant around 1908 began sending samples of his teas to potential customers packed in small silk pouches. He intended the pouches merely as a convenient form of packaging, expecting people to open them and brew the tea loose in the usual way. But his customers discovered that they could simply drop the entire pouch into a cup of hot water and get a perfectly satisfactory brew. They began ordering more of these pouches, and the tea bag was effectively born. The tea bag was a victory of convenience over traditional craft. It eliminated the need for a teapot, a strainer, and any knowledge of proper brewing. It made tea preparation as simple as boiling water and dunking a bag. In Britain, where tea tradition ran deepest, tea bags were initially viewed with deep suspicion. They were not introduced to the British market until 1953, and it took decades for them to gain widespread acceptance. But gain acceptance they did. Today, roughly 96% of all tea consumed in Britain is brewed from tea bags, a statistic that would have horrified the tea connoisseurs of previous centuries. The story of iced tea is equally American. At the 1904 World's Fair in the city of St. Louis, a tea merchant had set up a stand to offer free samples of hot Indian tea. Unfortunately, the summer was brutally hot, and visitors had absolutely no interest in a hot drink. In desperation, the merchant poured his tea over ice and served it cold. The result was an immediate sensation. Today, roughly 80% of all tea consumed in the United States is iced, a fact that reflects both the American love of cold drinks and the strong influence of the southern states, where sweet iced tea is an essential part of regional culture. And in the 1980s, in the city of Taichung in Taiwan, someone had the idea of adding chewy balls made from tapioca starch to iced tea. The exact origin is disputed between two tea shops, each claiming the invention. Regardless of who came first, this creation, known by various names including bubble tea and boba tea, exploded in popularity across East and Southeast Asia and has since spread to become a global phenomenon. Bubble tea shops can now be found in virtually every major city in the world, and the market is worth billions of dollars. Let us travel now to Russia, whose love affair with tea is one of the most enduring and distinctive in the world. The traditional date for tea's arrival in Russia is 1638, when a Russian diplomat returning from a visit to a Mongol court brought back a gift of roughly 64 kilograms of tea. According to the story, the diplomat was reluctant to accept the gift, considering it a worthless pile of dry leaves. But the Mongol ruler insisted, and when the tea was brewed at the Russian court, it was received with moderate interest. Over the following decades, the Russian taste for tea grew steadily. The crucial development was a treaty in 1689 that opened regular trade between Russia and China. Tea was carried overland by camel caravan across roughly 11,000 kilometers from Chinese trading towns on the Mongolian border all the way to Moscow and St. Petersburg. The journey took approximately 16 to 18 months, an immense logistical undertaking across some of the most inhospitable terrain on the planet. Russian merchants claimed that this overland tea tasted better than tea carried by ship because it never passed through the humid tropical conditions of a sea voyage. The most distinctive symbol of Russian tea culture is the samovar, a large metal urn with a central chimney heated by charcoal, believed to have originated in the Ural Mountains region during the mid-18th century. A small teapot containing a strong tea concentrate sits on top of the samovar, kept warm by the rising heat. To serve, a small amount of this dark, strong concentrate is poured into a cup or glass and diluted with hot water from the samovar's tap. The drinker controls the strength by adjusting the proportion. The samovar became the centerpiece of Russian home life, the focal point around which families gathered and guests were entertained. The expression "to sit around the samovar" became a way of saying to gather for warm, unhurried conversation. Russians developed their own customs too. Instead of adding milk, as the British do, Russians traditionally drink tea with lemon or with sugar held between the teeth, sipping the hot tea through the sweetness. Another old custom was pouring hot tea from the cup into the saucer to cool it, then sipping from the saucer. The great Russian writers of the 19th century, Pushkin, Tolstoy, Chekhov, and Dostoevsky among them, depicted tea drinking frequently in their works, using it as a window into themes of home, hospitality, social class, and the rhythms of daily life. The samovar appears again and again in Russian literature, a symbol of warmth and continuity. Now, a few words about the different types of tea, because this is something worth understanding, and it is simpler and more interesting than you might expect. All the teas in the world, every kind from the palest and most delicate to the darkest and most robust, come from a single species of plant. The extraordinary range of flavors, colors, and aromas is entirely the product of how the leaves are handled after they are picked. There are 6 recognized types, and they can be arranged on a kind of spectrum. White tea undergoes the least processing of any type. After picking the leaves, usually just the bud and 1 or 2 young leaves are simply withered in natural sunlight or a controlled indoor space and then dried. There is no heating, no rolling, no deliberate manipulation. The result is a tea with a very pale, nearly colorless infusion and a delicate, subtly sweet flavor. The finest white teas come from Fujian province in China. Green tea is the most consumed type in East Asia and the one with the longest continuous history. The key step is quickly heating the fresh leaves to stop them from darkening. In China, this is usually done by tossing the leaves in a heated pan, which gives a slightly nutty or toasty quality. In Japan, it is done with steam, which gives a more intensely green, almost sea-like character. After heating, the leaves are rolled to shape them and then dried. Yellow tea is the rarest of all 6 types, produced in only a few places in China in very small quantities. Its processing is similar to green tea but includes a gentle resting step in which the damp leaves are wrapped in paper or cloth and allowed to sit in their own warmth for hours or days. This produces a smoother, less sharp taste and a distinctive pale yellow color in the cup. Oolong tea occupies the vast and diverse middle ground between green and black. It is partially darkened, and the degree of change can range from very little to quite a lot, producing an enormous variety of flavors from light and floral to rich and fruity. Making oolong is the most complex and skill-dependent process of any tea type, involving multiple cycles of withering, bruising, darkening, and heating. Black tea, the type most familiar to Western drinkers, is fully transformed. After picking, the leaves are allowed to wither, then rolled to release their inner compounds, then spread out in a cool, humid space to darken completely. The resulting tea produces a rich, full-bodied cup in shades of amber to deep brown. And dark tea, of which the most famous example comes from Yunnan province, is unique because it undergoes a true transformation by living microorganisms, bacteria, and fungi that break down the compounds in the leaves over time. Some versions are compressed into cakes and aged for years or even decades, developing extraordinary depth and complexity. Vintage examples of this tea can sell for prices comparable to fine wine, and collectors pay handsomely for well-stored cakes from reputable producers. Now, let us pause and consider what modern science has discovered about tea and its effects on the body, because the research of recent decades has revealed tea to be one of the most complex and interesting plant products that human beings consume. The scientific study of tea has expanded enormously, producing tens of thousands of published research papers. Much of this research has focused on the protective compounds in tea, particularly those found in the highest concentrations in green tea. These compounds have been studied extensively in laboratory settings, where they have shown the ability to combat certain kinds of damage at the cellular level. However, it is important to say that the leap from laboratory findings to real-world health benefits is not always straightforward, and many of the most dramatic effects seen in a laboratory have not yet been conclusively confirmed in studies of actual human populations. The most solid evidence for health benefits relates to the heart and blood vessels. Several large studies, involving hundreds of thousands of people across multiple countries, have found that regular tea drinkers tend to have somewhat lower rates of heart attacks and strokes compared to people who do not drink tea. A major review of the available evidence found that drinking 3 or more cups of tea per day was associated with a meaningful reduction in the risk of these conditions. The effect appeared to be stronger for green tea than for black tea, possibly because green tea retains higher levels of those protective compounds. The calming compound unique to tea has attracted growing scientific attention for its effects on the brain and mental well-being. Studies have shown that it promotes a particular kind of relaxed brain activity, the kind associated with a state of calm, focused alertness, the same state that experienced meditators often describe. When this compound works alongside the gentle stimulant in tea, the combination has been found to improve attention, focus, and the ability to switch between tasks more effectively than either substance alone. This may be the scientific explanation for something that monks, scholars, and writers have known intuitively for centuries, that tea produces a quality of mental clarity and calm that is quite different from the stimulation provided by other drinks. It is worth noting that drinking tea that is extremely hot, above about 65 degrees, may actually carry some risk, because repeated burning of the tissues in the throat has been associated with certain health problems in that area. The lesson, happily, is a simple one. Let your tea cool for a moment before you drink it. The emerging field of research into the community of tiny organisms that live in our digestive systems has added new dimensions to the science of tea. The protective compounds in tea are not well absorbed in the upper part of the digestive system, which means that much of what you drink passes through to the lower portions, where it interacts with the vast population of beneficial organisms that live there. Early research suggests that tea may help promote the growth of helpful organisms while discouraging harmful ones, though this area of science is still quite young. So far, we can say with reasonable confidence that tea is a genuinely healthful drink when consumed regularly and in moderate amounts, that it appears to offer some real protection for the heart and blood vessels, and that its unique combination of a gentle stimulant and a calming compound produces a quality of focused relaxation that is unlike any other common drink. Not bad for a simple cup of dried leaves in hot water. Now, there is an important part of tea's story that is often overlooked, and it concerns the people who pick the tea we drink. Behind every cup of tea lies a human story, and for the millions of workers on tea plantations around the world, that story has often been one of exploitation and hardship. The plantation system that developed during the colonial era created some of the most enduring patterns of labor abuse in the history of agriculture. In India, workers recruited from far-off regions found themselves isolated and indebted. In Ceylon, Tamil workers from southern India were brought under conditions that ranged from difficult to desperate. After independence, many were left stateless, denied citizenship in the only country they had ever called home. These patterns have not disappeared with the end of colonial rule. On many plantations today, wages remain very low, housing is inadequate, and access to healthcare and education is limited. Fair trade and ethical certification programs have made some progress in improving conditions, setting standards for wages and working conditions, and providing funds for community development. But certified tea still represents only a small fraction of global production, and the deeper problems of poverty and inequality in the tea supply chain remain urgent challenges. The story of tea in Africa is one of the least known but most dynamic chapters of the entire tea saga. Tea was introduced to the African continent by European colonial powers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The earliest planting occurred in what is now Malawi in 1878. But the real African tea story belongs to Kenya, which had no tea industry at all before the early 20th century and is now the world's largest tea exporter, a transformation that is nothing short of extraordinary. After independence in 1963, the Kenyan government actively promoted tea cultivation among small farmers, providing technical support, subsidized seedlings, and organized marketing. The program was remarkably successful. The number of small tea growers expanded from a few thousand to more than 600,000, and these small farmers now produce the majority of Kenya's tea. Kenyan tea, bright, brisk, and full-bodied, became the backbone of the international tea bag market. But the challenges facing African tea producers are significant. Global tea prices have been declining in real terms, squeezing the incomes of both plantation workers and small farmers. And climate change poses what may be the most serious threat of all. Research has projected that rising temperatures could reduce the area suitable for tea growing in Kenya by as much as a quarter by the middle of this century, with potentially devastating consequences for the hundreds of thousands of families who depend on tea for their livelihoods. Tea has been one of humanity's great sources of artistic and literary inspiration across many cultures and many centuries, and it is worth pausing to appreciate just how deeply the leaf has woven itself into the creative life of the world. We have already heard the Tang Dynasty poet Lu Tong's ecstatic description of ascending through 7 bowls of tea toward heaven itself. The great Song Dynasty writer Su Shi, one of the most celebrated literary figures in all of Chinese history, was equally passionate about tea. He compared the finest tea to a beautiful woman, wrote poems celebrating teas from different regions, and engaged in witty literary debates with his friends about the proper methods of preparation. His writings are still read and loved in China today, nearly 1,000 years after they were written. In Japan, a writer named Okakura published a small, beautiful book in English in 1906 that did more than perhaps any other single work to explain the philosophy of tea to the Western world. He presented the tea ceremony not as a quaint foreign custom or an exotic curiosity, but as a complete philosophy of life, rooted in the deepest spiritual traditions of the East, offering a profound alternative to what he saw as the restlessness and materialism of the modern West. His book has been continuously in print for well over a century, which speaks to the enduring power of his vision. In European art, tea became a frequent subject from the 18th century onward. Dutch and Flemish painters of the Golden Age included tea sets and tea implements in their richly detailed domestic scenes and still lifes. English painters depicted fashionable families gathered around the tea table, and the Russian painter Boris Kustodiev created vivid, warmly colored scenes of Russian tea culture, with samovars gleaming on tables, surrounded by generous spreads of food and happy faces. In English literature, tea is everywhere. The poet Alexander Pope set a famous satirical scene around a tea table. The great Samuel Johnson described himself memorably as a hardened and shameless tea drinker who had for 20 years taken nothing but the infusion of this plant, whose kettle scarcely had time to cool, who with tea amused the evening, with tea consoled the midnight, and with tea welcomed the morning. The novels of Jane Austen and Charles Dickens are full of tea scenes, using the ritual of tea as a backdrop for the social observations that are the real substance of their art. And then there is the famously absurd tea party in a story about a girl who falls down a rabbit hole, one of the most beloved tea scenes in all of literature, both wildly comic and strangely unsettling at the same time. The great English writer George Orwell published his 11 Rules for the Perfect Cup of Tea in 1946, and this brief essay remains one of the most quoted pieces of tea writing in the English language. Among his rules was the firm insistence that the milk must be poured after the tea, not before, a position that continues to generate heated debate among British tea drinkers to this very day. He also argued that tea should be strong, that it should be served in a tall, cylindrical cup rather than a flat one, and that sugar should never be added because it destroys the flavor. Not everyone agrees, of course, but the fact that such questions are still debated with genuine passion tells us something about the depth of feeling tea inspires. During both World Wars, the British government considered tea so essential to national morale that it took extraordinary measures to ensure the supply reached both the civilian population and the armed forces. During the First World War, the government purchased the entire tea production of India and Ceylon to guarantee supplies. During the Second World War, the Prime Minister himself, Winston Churchill, insisted that tea supply for the troops was a matter of strategic priority, a military necessity rather than a mere comfort. Tea was rationed in Britain from 1940 to 1952, and the end of tea rationing was greeted with something close to national celebration. The phrase, "put the kettle on," meaning to make tea in response to any crisis or difficulty, large or small, became a defining expression of the British character, a quiet declaration that as long as there is tea, everything will somehow be all right. If we step back and look at the way different cultures around the world prepare and serve tea, we can see something quietly profound. Each tradition reflects the values and personality of the culture that created it. The Chinese approach emphasizes skill, patience, and the slow appreciation of subtle flavors across many steepings. The Japanese ceremony is a complete work of art, integrating architecture, ceramics, garden design, calligraphy, and flower arrangement into a total experience governed by principles of harmony, respect, purity, and tranquility. The Korean way favors naturalness and unforced simplicity. The British tradition wraps tea in social ritual, propriety, and domestic comfort. The Moroccan ceremony is a performance of generous hospitality. The Russian tradition centers on warmth, extended conversation, and the gathering of family. The Indian spiced tea tradition is democratic and universal, enjoyed by every class and background at the roadside stall. What unites all of these traditions, despite their enormous differences in form and philosophy, is the fundamental human impulse to take a simple act of drinking and transform it into something meaningful, something social, something that connects people to each other and to the moment they are sharing together. The global tea industry of our own time is an enormous enterprise, producing roughly 6 billion kilograms of tea each year and valued at approximately $69.5 billion. It is an industry that spans more than 60 countries and employs tens of millions of people, from the workers who pick the leaves in Highland gardens to the merchants who sell them in shops on city streets. China is by far the world's largest producer, responsible for roughly 40% of all the tea grown on Earth. China is also the world's largest consumer, drinking most of what it produces domestically. India is the second largest producer and a major consumer. Kenya, as we have discussed, is the largest exporter, sending the great majority of its production to international markets. Sri Lanka and Turkey round out the top 5. The industry is divided between two distinct worlds that coexist somewhat uneasily. The commodity market, which accounts for the vast majority of global production and consumption, deals in standardized, mass-produced tea, primarily the small uniform granules used in tea bags. This market is dominated by a handful of enormous multinational corporations. Commodity tea is traded through auction systems in major tea centers, and prices are driven primarily by supply and demand, with relatively little premium for quality or origin. The specialty market, by contrast, deals in artisanal, carefully sourced single-origin teas that are marketed to discerning consumers willing to pay premium prices for quality, character, and story. This market has grown rapidly since the 1990s, fueled by the same consumer trends that have driven the specialty coffee, craft beer, and artisanal food movements. Specialty tea shops, both physical and online, offer teas sourced directly from individual farmers and producers, with detailed information about where the tea comes from, how it was grown, how it was processed, and what it tastes like. This movement has revived interest in traditional tea types and methods that the commodity market had largely forgotten. The rise of matcha in Western markets has been one of the most striking consumer trends of recent years. This stone-ground green tea powder, used in the Japanese ceremony for centuries, was virtually unknown outside Asia until the early 2000s. Then, fueled by social media, the visual appeal of bright green matcha lattes, celebrity endorsements, and health claims related to its high concentration of protective compounds, the trend grew with remarkable speed. By the 2020s, matcha had become a mainstream ingredient, appearing not only as a drink, but in ice cream, chocolates, baked goods, and even cosmetics. The global spread of bubble tea from its Taiwanese origins has been equally remarkable. What began as a playful invention in a single tea shop has grown into a worldwide industry worth billions of dollars, with franchise chains operating thousands of outlets and the variety of flavors, toppings, and formats expanding constantly. In 2019, the United Nations declared May the 21st as International Tea Day, recognizing the cultural importance and economic significance of tea to countries around the world. It was a quiet but meaningful moment of global acknowledgement for a drink that has shaped human history for 5,000 years. But the future holds challenges that cannot be ignored, and they weigh on the tea world with growing urgency. Climate change is already altering the flavor and yield of tea in traditional growing regions. Scientific research has documented changes in the subtle chemistry of tea from established growing areas, including the loss of certain aroma compounds that contribute to the distinctive character of specific teas. In Darjeeling, erratic rainfall and rising temperatures are affecting both production and quality. In Assam, the intensification of monsoon rains and an increase in floods and droughts are disrupting the seasonal rhythms on which tea growing depends. In Kenya, the projections are sobering, suggesting that a significant proportion of currently suitable land may become too warm for quality tea within the next few decades. Labor conditions on many plantations around the world remain inadequate, with wages that advocates and human rights organizations call insufficient for a dignified standard of living. The fair trade and ethical certification movements are working to improve conditions, but the scale of the challenge is immense. And the livelihoods of millions of small farmers in Kenya, in India, in Sri Lanka, and elsewhere depend on prices that have been declining, in real terms, for years, squeezing the incomes of the very people who produce the world's tea. The story of tea is still being written in every tea garden and every factory and every cup, and its next chapters will be shaped by how the world chooses to respond to these challenges. And so we come at last to the end of our long journey together, and what a vast and winding journey it has been. Let us sit quietly now and look back over the ground we have covered, because the full sweep of it is something worth appreciating. We began in the misty forests of southwestern China, where a modest evergreen shrub quietly evolved over millions of patient years, the very chemical compounds that would make it irresistible to human beings. We learned that this plant's inner chemistry, its gentle stimulant, its calming compound, its bitter protectors, none of these were designed for us at all. They were weapons the plant evolved to defend itself against insects and disease. And we marveled at the quiet irony that the chemical arsenal of a humble shrub turned out to be the very thing that would make it one of the most desired plants in the history of human civilization. We stood beside an ancient tea tree in Yunnan province, more than 3,000 years old, its trunk nearly 6 meters around, still alive and growing in its forest on a misty mountainside. A tree that was already old when the Greek philosophers were debating, when the Roman legions were marching, when the Great Pyramids were still considered new. A living bridge between the present and the deep past. We heard the legend of an emperor sitting beneath a tree when a leaf drifted into his pot of boiling water, and the story of a monk so furious at falling asleep during meditation that he tore off his own eyelids, from which tea plants grew. We understood that these stories are not meant to be taken as literal history, but as cultural expressions of what tea means to the people who drink it. Wisdom, serenity, spiritual discipline, and the quiet gift of attention. We followed tea into the great Chinese dynasties. We watched it become a refined art in the hands of Lu Yu, the poor orphan who ran away from a monastery to join a troupe of traveling performers and then, through devotion and brilliance, wrote the first book about tea ever composed and became the sage of tea. We watched Song dynasty emperors compete to produce the finest whisked foam in their dark, beautiful bowls. We followed the peasant-born founding emperor of the Ming dynasty, who abolished the old compressed tea cakes with a single decree and gave the world the loose-leaf method we still use today. We walked the quiet corridors of Buddhist monasteries, where the ancient partnership between the leaf and the spirit of meditation was forged over more than 1,000 years. We followed Aisai as he carried tea seeds across the sea to Japan. We crawled through the tiny entrance of Rikyu's tea room and understood that the mightiest warrior must humble himself to enter the space where tea is served. We held a cracked, imperfect bowl in our hands and saw that true beauty lives in the weathered, the unfinished, and the touched by time. We felt the gentle aesthetic of Korean tea, with its love of naturalness and quiet sincerity. We traveled the treacherous paths of the Tea Horse Road alongside porters, bent double under loads twice their own weight, climbing through thin air toward passes 5,000 meters above the sea. We sat in a Tibetan home and drank 40 cups of butter tea while the cold wind howled against the stone walls outside. We sipped from tiny tulip-shaped glasses in a Turkish tea house and watched a Moroccan host pour mint tea from a foot above the glass. We heard the old proverb about 3 cups, gentle as life, strong as love, bitter as death. We felt the warmth of a Russian samovar and understood why the expression "to sit around the samovar" means so much more than simply making a drink. We crossed the oceans with the Portuguese and the Dutch and watched tea arrive in a Europe that did not yet know what to make of it. We watched a Portuguese princess bring her taste for tea to the English court and set in motion one of the most remarkable cultural transformations of the modern age. We followed tea as it swept through British society, from aristocratic drawing rooms to middle-class parlours to the cramped kitchens of the working poor, until it had become the national drink of a nation that had never grown a single tea leaf. We confronted the dark side of this love affair, the crushing taxes that drove one of the largest smuggling operations in European history, the adulterated tea coloured with toxic dyes that poisoned unsuspecting consumers, the colonists who dumped 342 chests into Boston Harbor and set a revolution in motion, the opium forced onto China to pay for British tea, and the wars that followed, wars that opened one of the world's oldest civilizations to a century of humiliation and exploitation. We traveled in disguise with Robert Fortune through the closed interior of China, watching him steal the secrets of an entire industry. We stood in the jungles of Assam as the first tea plantations were hacked from the forest, and we saw the laborers brought from far away, deceived and indebted, to work in conditions that should trouble any honest conscience. We watched James Taylor plant the first tea in Ceylon and Thomas Lipton turn it into a brand known in every home. We raced across 3 oceans on the fastest and most beautiful sailing ships ever built and watched them rendered obsolete in a single decade by the opening of a canal and the relentless progress of steam. We accidentally invented the tea bag and poured tea over ice on a sweltering afternoon at a World's Fair. We dropped tapioca pearls into iced tea in a shop in Taiwan and started a global craze that no one could have predicted. We learned what science has discovered about the compounds in tea, how they protect the heart, how they promote a unique state of calm alertness, how they interact with the living community of organisms in our digestive systems. We counted the 6 types of tea, from the palest white to the darkest aged variety, and marveled that all of them come from a single plant species. We acknowledged the human cost, the millions of workers past and present whose labor produces the tea the world drinks, and the many ways in which that labor has been, and in some places continues to be, inadequately compensated and insufficiently protected. And we look toward a future in which climate change, declining prices, and the urgent need for fairness and sustainability will shape whatever comes next. Through all of this, across 5,000 years and every inhabited continent, tea has remained what it always was at the very beginning. Dried leaves in hot water. A drink that is both utterly simple and endlessly, quietly deep. It has meant survival in Tibet and rebellion in Boston, spiritual practice in Japan and colonial exploitation in India, warmth and comfort in an English kitchen and quiet contemplation in a Chinese scholar's study on a rainy afternoon. It has been the drink of emperors and the drink of laborers, the drink of monks and the drink of merchants, the drink of the powerful and the drink of the poor. It has been a medicine, a luxury, a necessity, a cause of war, and a path to peace. The next time you hold a warm cup in your hands, you might pause for just a moment and think about the extraordinary journey that leaf has taken to reach you. Think about the ancient forests where it first grew wild, the trees that are older than recorded history. Think about the monks who carried seeds across mountains and planted them in monastery gardens. Think about the poets who found in a simple bowl of tea a gateway to something beyond the ordinary. Think about the sailors who raced across oceans to bring the freshest tea to market. Think about the hands that picked each leaf, the families who depend on the harvest, the cultures that shaped the rituals of preparation and were shaped by them in return. And perhaps, in that quiet moment, you will feel a small but real connection to all of those people across all of those centuries, every one of them doing the very same simple thing you are doing right now, placing dried leaves in hot water and waiting with a kind of patience and faith that needs no words for the quiet miracle of infusion to unfold. The story of tea is, in the end, a story about us. It is a story about how something so small and so ordinary can weave itself through the entire fabric of human history, touching everything it reaches, changing the world one cup at a time. It is a story that began in a forest 5,000 years ago and spread to every corner of the earth. And it is a story that, even now, is still being written in every kitchen, every tea house, every garden, and every monastery where someone reaches for a handful of dried leaves and a pot of hot water. And on that thought, let your eyes grow heavy if they wish. Let the warmth of the story settle around you like a soft blanket on a cold evening. There is nothing more you need to do tonight. No tasks to complete, no problems to solve, no plans to make. The leaf has traveled its long road across mountains and oceans and centuries, and you have traveled with it, and now it is time to let go of the day and rest. Good night, and sleep well.